Hi, and welcome to the Letter S podcast. My name is Joe Gross, and I'm joined by Anina Jasper Brody, who, like myself, experienced the loss of a parent at a young age. In this series, Anina and I will be sitting down with individuals from all ages and backgrounds, each having experienced the loss of a parent. Join us as we delve into their unique journeys, exploring how they've navigated challenges and found motivation to lead positive, meaningful lives. Together, we'll uncover inspiring stories and valuable insights that can enrich our own paths. I invite you to join us on our journey to spread awareness and hope to those seeking a community and happiness in their lives. Hi, everyone, and welcome today to a special episode of the Letter S podcast, which is not like our usual podcast. Today, Anina and I will be discussing our goals, our stories, just a little bit of background of each other, and what our mission is for this podcast. Anina, how are you today?
I'm good, thank God. I'm very excited for this episode. I think it'll be very cool and very different. How are you?
Thank God, everything's good. It's a nice day out. I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say, as I've never heard, of course, before this, what your thoughts are on the Letter S podcast.
Me too.
So now I'm going to go just a little bit about my background, my story, and Anina will follow after me. I'm originally from Teaneck, New Jersey. I lost my father at the age of 6. He passed away from a heart attack when he was playing basketball just on a weeknight with his friends. And I had found out the next morning from my mother telling me and bringing me down with all of my siblings to my living room, where the rabbi of my neighborhood told us the exact news of what exactly happened. This, of course, devastated me at the time. As I was 6 years old, though, I didn't fully grasp the idea of losing a father at that age until later on in my life, where my mother got remarried. I left Teaneck at the age of 10 and moved to Queens, New York, where I got a stepfather and a couple other siblings, three other siblings, and I pretty much started an entire new life at the age of 10. Not living with a father and having an entire new family, an entire new neighborhood, and a new school. And it was a lot of the time, of course, but again, didn't fully grasp it as I was only at the age of 10 at the time. And further on into my life, I went to SCRI for high school. I studied at H. Gesher for a year and graduated from YU recently, where I enjoyed studying Cy Sims business and am now working a full-time job. And thank God my life has been good so far. Of course, there have been a few challenges along the way, but I've learned a ton from it, and safe to say that I am looking forward to spending the rest of my life understanding or trying to figure out more about myself through the loss of my father, and also being motivated to aspire to be like him in all the attributes, how he was an amazing person, how he was one of the nicest people, as I always hear stories from all of his friends or family, and how amazing of a person he was to everybody. And I try to be like that and emulate that every single day.
Thank you, Joe, for sharing that. And it's very interesting to hear all of that because, of course, we've been working on this podcast for a while, but certain things come up when there's just an episode like this where it's just us speaking. So thank you for sharing that. Segueing off what Joe shared, I'll share a little bit about myself. I am from Riverdale, New York. My father had cancer. He got re-diagnosed with cancer when I was 5 years old. I have a twin brother, and I've always lived in Riverdale with my brother and my mom and my dad when he was alive. I went to SAR Academy since I was 4 years old. When I was 8, my father passed away from cancer, and I was in second grade at the time. And ever since then, I've been trying to figure out, what this loss meant. Obviously, I did not understand anything at that age. I remember my father died second days of Pesach, second days of Pesach, and I remember my grandmother crying in my living room and me not understanding what that meant. And only a few years later did I realize that it meant that she lost her son and she would never get to see him again, until Mashiach comes, obviously. And it didn't register right away, but I think that that's a pretty foundational moment in my life, seeing that when I was so young. Moving on, I also went to SAR High School. My mom recently got engaged to Jeff. Shout out.
Mazel tov.
Thank you. And I went to Harova for Shana Aleph and a month of Shana Bet. In Harova, I grew a lot religiously, obviously, and also trying to figure out, what could I make out of this loss, because I still had a lot of questions, and there was still a lot I was trying to figure out. And thank God I was able to not get the answers, because I don't really think that there are full answers to the types of questions that we have about losing a loved one at a young age or at any time in life. But I was able to get a lot of more clarity, which I'm very grateful for. And now I'm a junior at Stern, majoring in early childhood Jewish education.
Wow. Sounds like your father was a great person. It sounds like you are enjoying Jewish education for sure over the last several years.
Yeah, for sure.
And of course, at a later episode or through our shorts, we are more than happy to go more into detail of our own stories and of our loved ones too. But Anina, I'm actually so curious. How did you start this idea? As some people know, some don't. I came on a little bit later on. Anina started her own branch of the Letter S podcast before we started the full on podcast. But what was the idea that came into your mind that said, I need to start this podcast about talking about people who lost the lives of their loved ones? What came to your mind, and when did this happen?
So it's a really interesting question because I don't really know the full answer to the question, but I think that when you're a senior in SR High School, you have to do this project called Senior Exploration, where it's basically a passion project. Some people do internships, some people do projects, and this idea is introduced to you pretty early on in senior year, and then you're thinking all of senior year, oh, what am I going to do? So I went through a few different options, nothing having to do with the podcast in my mind, and they didn't work out, which was totally fine, obviously. And I think that throughout my whole life, I've struggled with talking about the loss of my dad because I don't want to be looked at differently. So in a situation where someone would ask about my parents, I would lie and I would say, like, my mom does this and my dad does this, because I was so uncomfortable with the whole concept of saying, like, oh, my dad passed away, and then they'd be like, oh, I feel so bad, like, whatever. So I think that I really struggled with talking about it, but something that I think is very important to talk about is losing a parent at a young age, or losing anyone at a young age. And I think that a certain light bulb went off in my head when I was like, what should I do for Senior X? And I was like, you know what, like, I like podcasts. I'm going to start a podcast for kids or anyone who lost a parent, because it's a very important topic to talk about, and it's not spoken about nearly enough, or wasn't spoken about nearly enough. And I think that a lot of people can benefit from it. And also, even if you've never lost a parent, like, if you didn't lose a parent at a young age, you could still benefit, as you probably know if you're listening to this, a lot from the podcast. So I think that that's kind of what sparked the idea in my head. And then obviously there were a lot of steps, because first I had the idea and then you have to, like, find people to interview. So shout out to Joe. He was one of the first interviews, and I interviewed four other people, and it was really like just a project. Like, it was really just a project, not what it is now at all, as we can both attest to. But it was really just a project.
Sounds great. Was there anyone in SAR that was on board with your idea when you had mentioned it to whether the advisor that you were working with or some type of other administration at the school? Did they say, like, this was, a great idea and kind of help you, or was it just a lot, by yourself?
I mean, I had my advisor, I think a lot of people were very surprised by the idea because it's not something that you hear every day.
Right.
And I think that, yeah, I think that they didn't really want to be, oh, like over my shoulder. They kind of wanted me to figure it out by myself because, a lot of the people at SA are still, they can't relate to this. So they don't really know how to help. But when they heard about it, they were very moved and very inspired and were like, that's an amazing idea. And it's funny, I was sitting in a class in Stern and Dr. Schwartz's daughter came up to me and was like, oh, like you're that girl who does that podcast. Like my mom talks about it all the time, right? Like that was like 3 years ago. And if Dr. Schwartz is watching this, like, hi. Um, and I think that that's really, it does make an impact on people. And even though they weren't like, oh, how could we help? You know, administrators and teachers and my friends were very moved by the project.
Right. And that's a great point. That's exactly one of the reasons as to why, I'm here. And once you asked me to come on several months ago, I thought it over, of course, and it came out to be a great idea because I felt like there was a need for it. But one of the goals is not just for people who lost a loved one to understand and hear what other people have to say or feel like they're part of a community and more, but also for people who did not lose someone, how to help out their friends who are going through something, or even through any of the challenges they may go through in their own life if it's not related to losing a loved one, but something else they can learn from other people who went through different challenges because it can be incorporated to anything in life.
Yeah, I think that, as you said, just echoing off what you said, I think that I've had people who said to me, like, I don't know, like, why am I like, whatever, why should I listen? I thank God still have two parents alive, and I'm like, you know what? I understand why you're asking that question, but there's so many things, and like I could pickpocket like certain things off every episode where it's like you can gain so much from this. I know that unfortunately there have been other kids in my grade who have lost parents, and people are going to pay a shiva call. This either whether in high school or now, and people are like, I don't know what to do at a shiva call. I don't know what to do at a funeral. I don't know how to act. It's so awkward. And I think that one of the things that we're gonna continue to do through this podcast is tell people this is like good things to say at a shiva house. This is not what to say at a shiva house. And I think that everyone can gain a lot from this podcast, no matter what your story is. Yeah.
Definitely have to agree with that. What may be some other goals that we can let our listeners know that we are really striving to gain from this podcast?
I think the importance of talking about the loss. As I said, and Joe, I'm curious what your relationship was to talking about the loss before the podcast, if you want to share a little bit about that also.
Yeah, of course. I was never so strong about letting people know my story, but I was never against it. For example, I wouldn't go out there and explicitly tell people, oh, I lost my father, Mitch at a young age, and this is who I am and this is what about me. But I never kind of was hiding it from anybody. Anytime someone brought something up, and if it was the appropriate time, then I would mention it, but I would never go out of my way to say it. It was more of just however the conversation flowed. As I'm a pretty open person, I would feel comfortable talking about it, but as long as it's the right time and it makes sense. However, I wouldn't always just go out of my way to say it or hide it from anyone overall. So to answer your question, yes, I would talk about it and feel comfortable talking about it, but only if it made sense at the time.
Right. So you sound like you had a better way of talking about your loss. Like some people are more comfortable and some people are less comfortable. I think that one of the goals of this podcast is to make people more comfortable and to make people realize that like just because you went through this like really hard thing when you were young doesn't mean that you're like a black sheep or you're not different just because you went through this hard thing. In fact, I think that, and this is one of the questions we ask people we interview, but I think that challenges and difficulty does build character, right? And a lot of what we've heard is that people who have lost a parent at a young age, they're they have been needing to grow up faster and become more mature earlier. So I think, in fact, obviously I would never choose this, but it does help you grow and become a more mature person earlier.
Yeah,
Yeah.
100%. And I think another thing that we want people to get from this podcast is, like we said, talk about it, make it more normal to have these conversations, to speak more comfortably about the loss of our parent, but actually channeling those emotions, understanding that it's okay to have these emotions, whether it's upset, happy about certain aspects of life, or losing the loved one, and just really talking about it. But it's just really important for people to know that everything is totally normal when going on and talking about it and whatever emotions you have, but even more so to really emphasize and show that you care and that you have these emotions is what this is really all about, because it's very normal and that you should be showing something from you from talking about it or having that ability to do so.
Right. Talking about it isn't shameful. It's like, in fact, the opposite. It's admirable, and it's really important.
Yeah, and just by talking about it, people learn a lot more about those people or about their past, like pretty much their past and what's going on in their lives, but not trying to emphasize that this person is all about how they lost someone, but kind of trying to find that middle ground as we're still trying to find that and discuss with every person that we come on. But what is that middle ground? How do we figure that out? And we could figure that out together.
Yeah. Because it's interesting what you said, because it's about talking about the loss, and it's also about where you are today, and also it's about honoring that the memory of your parent that you lost, which I think that it's very important, because obviously they're not here physically anymore, but they're still here, in a very spiritual way, and it's important to honor their memory, and through this podcast talk about them and help keep their presence in this world, which I think is very important, obviously.
Yeah, 100%. Just another goal to add that we have is what type of coping mechanisms can we let our listeners know? Can we learn from other people? How to exactly bring up those conversations? What's a good way to get it off our mind at the right time or think about it, the right amount of time that we're going about our days? What can we do to make ourselves more comfortable when we are at a Shiva house? All of these things that we touched upon a little bit, but even more so, just how do we go about our days and what's the best way to do it? What are these different coping mechanisms that we can bring is something that we definitely strive to do. Something that we already got on one of our podcasts about coping mechanisms is, I believe it was Eliana Neighbors' episode. She had mentioned something about a breathing strategy to help herself get over certain challenges or certain aspects of life that she was struggling in. And that's something that we want to hear more about. How can we educate people on how to handle this better or in just a good way?
I think also, when you lose a parent, I don't know, I feel like it can feel very lonely, and no one knows what I'm going through. And I think that this podcast shows you that people do know what you're going through, and people are here to guide you. And whether it's us or someone else, a psychologist, a mentor, in any form, I think that it's very important to try not to have that mindset of, I'm alone and no one cares about me, because that's 100% not true. And there's, thank God, a lot of resources, this podcast being one of the many, of people that do really care and do want to help you. And the worst thing to do, I think, is to say, no one's there for me, no one cares about me, no one knows what I'm going through, because that's just not true. Obviously everyone goes through loss differently, but it's people do know what you're going through. We know what you're going through.
That's a great point, just to explain to everyone that they aren't alone and that it's okay again to be sad and to have these feelings, but knowing that there is an alternative, there is a solution to help them out, as we are one of them, of course, but to go to anyone, to speak to anyone, and to be okay with it, to finally find a way to be comfortable. Of course, it's not comfortable and not normal to be talking about it, as it's a unique case, but again, it's not as unique as we have learned, and that there really is a way that people can, you know, not just survive but strive in life with
Yeah.
losing a loved one. And of course, Anina, at the beginning of every episode, you ask our famed question, what does the letter S mean to you? Going from the word parents to parent by having just a singular parent, or sometimes even no parent at all, but just losing that S at the end of the word parents means something to people. So what does that letter mean to you?
But the letter S for me before the beginning of the podcast and now has a totally different relationship. I think that in the beginning of the podcast, before I created it, it was very hard for me to hear people say the word parents, or even, I don't know if you've realized this, but when you're typing on a computer and it says, and you write parent, it always autocorrects to parents, or there's a blue line under that word. And it was very triggering for me before because people, at least I had a hard time. I felt like people weren't aware enough of that. And now I think that, as I mentioned earlier, I'm much more comfortable talking about it. I'm much more able to say, I lost my dad when I was 8. And I think that the letter S is now able to open up a conversation instead of being a conversation that I want to run away from. It's a conversation that I want to have. And I think that that's my relationship with the letter S. What about you, Joe?
I think that's a good point. Opening up the conversation with the letter S, not running away from it. And that's something that I kind of realized, as we went on with the podcast and coming on the original time to the letter S podcast back in SAR. I be honest with you, I never really thought about the word parents and, having the letter S. Of course, I thought about not having a parent, but never the full idea of the letter S and what it really means, that word specifically to me. But gradually over time, as we've been doing this podcast, listening to all these different stories, I kind of reflected a little bit on it and kind of took the letter S as something unique to me, it's something for me to to boast about and to really show people that this is a unique case to me. How can I show people how I'm able to get through it and how I can reflect and emphasize on what's going on with me so I can make other people stronger or inspire other people? And that's pretty much exactly how the letter has gotten to me, how I can really show people what it means, and that it's not necessarily a bad thing, but something for me to educate other people on and to understand what is going on with other people that may have this thing going on.
Thank you for sharing that, Joe. It's really beautiful and it's really interesting because I think that a lot of times when something hard happens to someone, people just want to keep it to themselves. And I think that what we've done in this podcast is take something that we both went through and what other people who have been through on this podcast also went through and build something from it. It's not always, I don't know, I can speak for myself that sometimes it's like a little emotional and I'm like, whoa, like that's a lot. But I think that when I look at the bigger picture, like God willing, we are and will continue to really help people. And I think that a big value in Judaism is taking what you went through and helping people who are taking what you went through and helping people who are also going through that. Not keeping your hardships to yourself, but also helping people, mentoring people, talking to people
Right.
who have gone through similar things. As we've mentioned so much in this episode, that's what this podcast is trying to do. So I think it's really interesting.
Anina, thank you again for sharing all of those amazing points and advice. I think a lot of people can understand what you're going through by sharing a little bit of your background as well as mine, but also all of the amazing advice that you gave and to really learn a lot and grow from what you said and hopefully what I said too. And part of our mission is just being able to reflect our stories and explain what we've learned from it. And how you can help out our mission is, of course, by sharing this episode, sharing all of our other episodes, following our Instagram page, and really more of just expressing through word of mouth what we're trying to do here, what our mission is, like we've mentioned in this podcast. But just being able to express to other people how to be comfortable about talking about this, how about sharing it, is what we're really all about. And of course, donating to our page can help us up and running too, continue with this podcast. Really, I just want to stress being able to share what we spoke about today, but really just talking about the essence of our podcast can really change a lot of people's lives, and you really don't know it until it happens. And it's an amazing feeling, as Anina and I have felt, just by reaching one person really changes our lives and their lives too. What's up and coming for our podcast in the future, hopefully really, really soon, You will see we're interviewing rebellion, psychologists, and other amazing stories and unique stories that we've heard from other people that can really change your perspective on life that I'm really looking forward to sharing with everyone.
I can definitely agree with everything Joe said, and I'm very excited for the next exciting episodes. And there's a lot to look forward to. And Joe, thank you for doing this episode. It was very great to hear your perspective on the podcast and a little bit about your story. And I think that this was a really amazing episode. And thank you everyone for listening to the episode. And remember to share, talk about it. Even if you're sitting at a shop table or you're sitting at a table and someone's talking about, unfortunately, someone who lost a parent or anyone in their family, or even, again, anyone can get you knowledge from this podcast. Just say, oh, you know what? I've heard of this really amazing podcast. It's called The Letter S. Go check it out. It literally happened to me this Shabbos. I mean, I'm the one that was like, oh, I have this podcast. But but it's so easy to just talk about it. Share it with your friends, share it with your family members. Put a poster up in your building. I don't know. Maybe don't do that. Anyway, thank you so much.
Poster's a great idea. But yeah, just really letting people know, because you don't know how many lives you can change. And just a single life that you change can really change your life too.
Thank you again so much for listening to another episode of the Letter S podcast, inspiring one life at a time. Please make sure to check out our Instagram at the Letter S podcast _. If you have any questions or are interested in hopping on a mic with us, feel free to email us at theletterspodcast@gmail.com. And as always, stay in touch.